Good afternoon and welcome to Lost Dogs, a conversation on missing and murdered journalists. This week we have myself, Christian Tabak.
I'm John Hayes.
And I'm Dylan Rouse.
Yeah. Of course, viewer discretion is advised as we get into the topics of our podcast. We do cover some more disturbing and sometimes graphic cases involving journalists who have been either gone missing, tortured, in this case, violently killed. This week's alleged. In this week's case, we're covering the murder of Saudi Arabian journalist Jamal Kashoggi. He was a pretty prominent Saudi Arabian journalist, been working in the field for several decades, came back to the U.S., ended up dismembered in a Saudi Arabian embassy in Istanbul, Turkey. It was
Right.
one year ago, actually.
1 year, okay.
Happened October 2nd, so just a little over a year.
Yeah, it seems like it happened a really, really long time ago.
Well, there's been so much
yesterday
news.
as well, yeah.
Yeah, it's been such a prominent case. It's still a lot of conspiracies, everything going on about it. The UN actually just kind of released their official verdict about it back in June, that the Saudi Arabian government was in fact involved, according to the UN, but that's getting a bit ahead of what's going on in the
Okay.
situation.
Explain to
Start at
those
the
who don't
beginning.
know.
Started at the beginning, okay. October 2nd, 2018, Mr. Khashoggi goes, he's going to marry his longtime fiancée. Goes from, he lives in Virginia now, working as a columnist for the Washington Post.
Okay.
Ended up leaving Saudi Arabia after being criticized for his outspoken views against the Saudi Arabian government, kind of critical of more conservative views, especially the actions and kind of work of the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. They kind of have a bit of a controversy going on between each other over several years. But what ends up happening is Khashoggi goes to the embassy to get some documents so he can finally get married, goes in, and is not seen again.
Wow.
Yeah. Eventually it comes out kind of that apparently this group of 15 men associated with the Saudi Arabian government goes in there, tranquilizes him, and then dismembers him at the command of the Crown Prince. But before I get too many details of the actual case itself, some background on Khashoggi and his interesting views on, and controversial views, I should say, on the Saudi Arabian government and how that fits in.
Okay.
Of course, he was born 1958, did his first primary and secondary education in Saudi Arabia,
Mhm.
so a pretty conservative background, but eventually comes and gets his bachelor's in business administration at Illinois State University.
And I imagine that's what changed things from there.
That kind of gets his, of course, he experienced, the kind of the radicalization, the Iranian Revolution, and the subsequent move to more conservative Islamic roots, both in the region as a whole, but especially Saudi Arabia. He eventually goes back to Saudi Arabia. Of all things, ends up managing a bookstore. That's where his business administration degree goes.
Wow.
But after a few years doing that, he gets on as a correspondent with the Saudi Gazette, and from there it just takes off. 6 years of doing that, he ends up becoming the editor-in-chief of another Saudi newspaper, and kind of works with dailies, weeklies, and his correspondent work takes him all over the Middle East, where he does high-profile cases. I mean, this guy interviews Osama bin Laden prior to the 9/11, everything like that. He's
So talking to some pretty high-profile people pretty regularly and just making his way around.
Yeah, he's a pretty high-profile journalist who he knows his stuff, pretty experienced. Throughout all that, he's a print guy. But what ends up happening is he gets involved with another newspaper in 2003, and two of his columns end up criticizing the Saudi Arabian government, particularly for its more conservative religious views and how it's repressive, especially towards journalism and everything in that vein. Within 2 months, they fire him from this position, and thankfully for him, he lands on his feet and ends up becoming the media advisor for the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the United Kingdom. Stays in this role for a while, and again, oddly, despite his controversial views with the Saudi Arabian government, he ends up being appointed as the head of a 24-hour Saudi Arabian news organization, state-run news organization.
Of course.
But somehow, despite the fact that he's been hypercritical, he winds up in this job. I don't know if it's a
That's
case
weird.
of, keep your enemies close, at least he's going to be in this role, but they at least recognize the fact that he was a pretty reliable journalist and could handle something like this.
So it's more of like a respect
Yeah.
kind of thing than like we actually want you here in this job.
It was like he was, the kind of, for a while, one of the most recognizable authorities in Saudi Arabian journalism. so he winds up in this role in 2010, keeps that going, moves on along that, and then they do another branch of this station. And he makes a decision not long into this, several months into this, he interviews an opposition leader, which was not a good choice. The Saudi Arabian government cut down on this, they cut this branch of the channel, and that's kind of sends his career once again down, and he decides, okay, he's afraid for his life, moves to the United States, settles in Virginia, and that's when he decides he's going to get on as a columnist with the Washington Post.
And he has a pretty big background and resume of people that he's talked to and jobs that he's had. It probably wasn't too hard to land that gig.
Yeah, they were kind of happy to have that on there, and he was speaking a lot about what the kind of situation of people who spoke out against the government, even both activists, journalists, everything. That was kind of the focus of his column, was what is it like to speak out against the Saudi Arabian government, and what's it like for journalists? We hear a lot about it, but he was able to give a kind of first-hand experience, especially how it progressed, from the 90s to now. Settled in like that, kind of was enjoying his life, stateside. Like I said, he had his fiance, and he decided, okay, time to settle down, marry, but he needed some paperwork from the Saudi Arabian government to go ahead, get this going. He was previously married, had to settle some things, and so good neutral area to go to, the Saudi Arabian embassy in Istanbul, Turkey. He told his fiance, he's like, hey, go ahead, put the word out. If you don't hear back from me,
I mean, at least he was cautious about it.
Exactly. He already was, kind of like, okay, if I'm going back over there, kind of
might be
worried.
some problems, yeah.
But enough that it was like, he got the go ahead. It's like, Saudi Arabia's not going to do anything. They'll let him go in. Total confirmation. He made phone calls, everything beforehand. He wasn't going to be apprehended. He'd been told everything's fine. Goes into the embassy. No one hears from him again. This is where, a lot of conspiracies kind of circle up what exactly happened. At first, the Saudi Arabian government denied that he never reemerged.
Yeah.
He came back out. In fact, they had someone actually pose as Mr. Khashoggi, going around town, downtown Istanbul, like everything was fine. Eventually, of course, that was blown, and as people investigated, audio, no camera footage, but some recorded audio, revealed that what had happened is while he was in there, he was accosted by 15 men, drugged, and subsequently dismembered right there in the embassy.
Yeah, I remember reading those TV like news articles and seeing the reports on television.
Yeah.
Just how brutally it was described.
It was, kind of hear a lot about journalists, but you don't usually think in this case, maybe journalists being imprisoned, journalists, being shot, and combat journalists, things like that. But this is a guy who totally removed himself, was just doing, things in the United States, and he gets brutally killed like this.
Cut up and put into briefcases if he walked out of an embassy.
Exactly. It's like, okay. And it kind of goes from there, exactly who was behind it. Eventually it was established, and the United Nations did do an investigation into this because this is a pretty, high-profile case. And
Yeah.
especially considering this is happening in an embassy of all things, when the guy was given a clear, no action was being taken against him. And they did rule that this was, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. This was done at his command. Bin Salman has adamantly denied his involvement, kind of loosely expressed his condolences, although at the same time being like, hey, he was a critic, I'm not going to complain that he's gone. But the Saudi Arabian government has also denied that it's had too much of an involvement in it. They've admitted that from what they can tell, this is premeditated, that these 15 guys, somehow were involved in this, and this is more of a criminal, unrelated thing. The men in question were arrested. 4 or 5 of them were actually sentenced to death over this. But as far as where it goes from there, United Nations says it's bin Salman, but there's no clear correlation to what's happening. And investigations are still pending.
It doesn't make their alibi doesn't make any sense. Come up with a better story than that.
Yeah.
A journalist from the Washington Post doesn't get involved with criminals at an embassy.
It just doesn't happen like that. It actually went as far, President Trump, Donald Trump, weighed in on this. Originally, when all this was breaking, his view was backing the idea that this was some kind of random act of crime. These people had gotten into the embassy, and it was unrelated to the government.
Even without like completely knowing all the details yet.
even
Well,
without.
he was very critical of Trump as well, being here in America and reporting on him from the Washington Post.
Yeah.
So Trump's not a fan of his either.
But you would think, like, as a president, you, like, would put those views aside, like, and be a little bit more
Let's not
sensitive.
get ahead of ourselves
about the
with our
topic.
president.
Well, and Dylan brings up a good point too here as well. Even in Saudi Arabia, Mr. Khashoggi was very critical of the Trump administration. In fact, one of his columns that was called out by the government was him, arguing not to support the Trump administration from Saudi Arabia. That both the ultra-conservative Saudi Arabian government and the Trump administration were, problems for Saudi Arabia. So it's definitely a interesting political mix in that. Still a case that remains to be fully solved, and they're still looking into.
So this is just a guy that seems like he had enemies everywhere that he went, and very, very outspoken, and was never afraid to speak his mind. Do we think that, like, do we know if, like, he had any allies while he was going back that, other than, like, his family that he told that he was going to be over there, if he was already having, like, some kind of concerns for his safety? Like, is there anyone else that he could have reached out to as far as protection goes?
Well, that's kind of unclear what exactly his whole network was over there. He does come from, kind of a well-known family overall. His uncle was involved as, a billionaire arms dealer in the Iran-Contra scandal back in the 1980s. His cousin, of all people, was Princess Diana's boyfriend, who also died with her in the Paris car crash. So he's had connections with money, people in power, both, European and American side, as well as back in, the Middle East. How exactly that weighed in on this situation? Like I said, he got in clearance from the government. He had some connections in the government who said he'd be safe. It seemed like everything was going to go kosher.
I don't think you can really trust an authoritarian government when you're critical of them while also being a citizen of that government for a while until did he fully immigrate here to the United States? Did he hold any citizenship still over in Saudi Arabia?
He was still a Saudi citizen, but he
Okay.
was, it's more like asylum since he was in fear of his.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, it was kind of a mistake going back. I'm pretty sure you could find an embassy here in America, but
I don't- So, did he have to go back? Like, was that the thing that he had to go back, or did he have, like, business that he just had to take care of there?
The way it worked out is that's how he had to do it. He is both of Turkish and Saudi Arabian ancestry. So everything that he had to do, if he couldn't get back to Saudi Arabia, it would have to be done in Turkey.
okay, that makes sense. I was wondering why he had to go to Istanbul
Yeah.
and couldn't just
Do like a,
go to the New York embassy or the one there in Washington.
yeah.
But I don't really know what else there is to say on this besides the fact that he's, it's honestly a humanitarian crime when it comes down to it, pressing the freedom of press.
Well, and it's interesting, despite the fact that the UN has ruled, of course, that this is something that's come down from the Saudi Arabian government itself, and not just from anyone in the Saudi Arabian government, but the Crown Prince. The United States has been kind of slow to distance itself or even kind of openly condemn. Congress did condemn the actual killing itself, but this hasn't motivated any kind of, reprisal or something again to motivate, hey, let's see Saudi Arabia improve its treatment of dissidents and, outspoken journalists, of which it has a very poor reputation in its treatment of people covering its inner workings.
So do we think things are going to get better from here as far as representation and safety goes, or is this just a situation where things like this are just going to keep continuing to be covered up?
Personally, I think if there was any case that was going to set a trend or kind of take this in a more positive direction, it would have been this one. This is a guy who's with the Washington Post, very high profile, and nothing seems to have changed. The Saudi Arabian government's not held accountable.
It's just so brutal and so sketchy. You disappear without a trace. No one knows where you are whatsoever. And then there are all these foggy details, and then you get caught up in all of these lies, and everyone's like, oh, my bad. Like, he actually is dead. We just needed some more details and more time to what it seems like get a story together that we wanted to present, you know?
It's the House of Saud. I mean, they can get away with whatever they want in Saudi Arabia, and they own that country with an iron. The country's named after the actual family. So, I mean, they can get away with whatever they want, and I don't think they put too much effort or thought into an actual story. They just wanted this man dead.
Yeah.
And they got away with it. I mean, people know that they did it, and what are you going to do?
It's definitely an interesting case for journalists operating outside of America.
I'd like to say that Jamal is more of a martyr for those looking for freedom of speech in Saudi Arabia and wanting to actually have an independent press that's not supported by the government. Like you say, he worked for a 24-hour state-run news station.
Yeah.
And, I mean, he couldn't have been too happy with that, knowing his reputation.
Well, and he dared to bring an opposition leader on to actually get his views on it. I mean, that was incredibly...
That's bold.
In Saudi Arabia, you don't do that.
This is a horrible story and horrible details. I mean, they don't... It's not confirmed that he was chopped up, of course, and mutilated, but all the theories point to all the men left with bags and briefcases that looked a little bit more full than...
Was. Well, and that's kind of the official story. I mean, and of course, with the original one being he was still alive, and then the next one being that, okay, well, something did happen to him, and ultimately, okay, yeah, not just anything happened to him, he was dismembered. Conspiracies abound. What exactly happened to him? It's not clear.
So has his family commented any more on, like, their thoughts following any of this?
Still just criticism, you know, of course, they want to know what's going on and what more accountability. This is, you know, we're dealing, you know, just a year over the actual, you know, case, and still nothing clear.
What has the Washington Post done in the time since October?
I like that question, too.
You know, they've covered it and been outspoken as far as what exactly have they done. They've supported the United Nations resolution that, you know, this is what needs to, you know, we need to be looking into exactly how bin Salman was involved and holding the Saudi royal family responsible for its actions against journalists.
Which is not going very well when you're having a country that you run with an iron fist and is supported by the United States, the land of the free.
So do we see there being a second push or maybe a resurgence for justice here with this case, or do we think it's just another one of those that's just going to fade into the ashes and never really get fully resolved?
Well, I feel like he lives as kind of he's kind of a martyr now, in a way, for Middle Eastern journalists and journalists around the world that work and try to report freely in countries that have authoritarian regimes. And, you know, he spoke out against those who were in power, and he paid a price for it, but, you know, in a way he can kind of give attention to those that are suppressed, in a way, journalists that are suppressed. It's tragic that he lost his life, but it is also good that so much attention is being drawn to the House of Saud and their actions about suppressing journalists and those who would report truly on them and from all sides.
Agreed.
Yeah. I don't kind of see this coming up, you know, again as a major, you know, push into finding out what's going on and the accountability, just because it's been so slow. You've seen it kind of pop up again as we reach that year anniversary, you know, what's going on with this case, but no serious inquiries.
It's just sad.
It is very sad.
Well, that's all the time that we have for today. Make sure to give us a follow on Twitter at Lost Dogs Pod, or like us on Facebook at Lost Dogs Podcast. And if you have any story ideas, be sure to send them to lostdogsok@gmail.com. That's it for this episode of Lost Dogs. We'll see you all next time.